So we're going back to Till We Have Faces, our second approach to it. It is a retelling of the myth of Cupid and Psyche, as I said to you, and a reworking of a story by Apuleius, which Lewis cites. The book's called The Golden Ass, and it's something that he wanted to address for decades as a theme, which is really interesting to me, that it was that influential on him that he wanted to write on it. And he finally figured out how to do it. And he did it in the form of a myth. Now, recall what I said to you about Lewis's conversion, or what you've heard over and over and over again, how Lewis's own conversion began about a discussion about myths with Tolkien and Hugo Dyson, late night walk on Addison's Walk, and the suggestion that was made, which was for Lewis revelatory, that when it came to Christianity, it was a true myth. It was a historical myth. It was myth that had become fact. And this is also a recasting of a myth, and it's clearly in mythological terms. And yet it's presented as historical fact. And I think that's interesting, that Lewis has been at pains throughout the telling of Till We Have Faces to give historical detail to it in the same way that we find in the gospel accounts. It's not characteristic of myths that one should include those sort of details, but Lewis is at pains to do so, and in part because he wants to emulate, I'd say, the storytelling model of the Gospels. Because myths are a lot like fairy tales in general, insofar as they often have an enigmatic location. It's unclear where it happens or when it happens, and how it relates to time, also very unclear. You're not given dates, times, places, any specifics. And what that does, the effect of that, is draws the reader's attention to the character's actions, because you don't have any details besides that, and they're actually irrelevant. That's the fact that you're casting it in terms that don't give you details about times and places and specifics, is to show that what is really important is the actions of the characters and the choices the characters make. And what that does then is to demonstrate that these aren't just stories of irrelevant characters. It further insinuates that the actions of the characters are in some sense archetypal, and in that sense true. And you'll find that in historical myths, compilations of myths, stories, myths, and legends of the sort that are very much of interest to many of our contemporaries, Jordan Peterson amongst them. But there are others that are spending a great deal of time on the idea of myths and legends and stories and the archetypal significance thereof. And there's a great deal of study on mythology and folklore in the 20th century. And I don't want to spend too much time talking about that, but I have a whole list of books that are devoted to exactly that, and the truth of myth and story and legend. And part of the whole truth and reconciliation aspect of contemporary culture in Canada is to ascribe some sort of truth significance to the storytelling of natives, telling their truth and so forth. So it's ascribing something to of veracity to storytelling itself. Now, note, in the storytelling that is in that particular situation, it's often void of the exact specifics that I'm talking about that are characteristic of the gospel account. We're not given the time and the place and the situation. So historicity is lacking in those accounts. They are archetypally significant. They're said to be of broader ongoing significance, but they're not presented as historically valid or historically accurate. That's never claimed. It's just that they are, in some sense, valid because they're archetypally significant. And so there's a tendency then to read them allegorically and to moralize them. And even to do what often takes place in works like this, to engage in what we call euhemerism. Now, I don't know if you've heard of Emoris or not, but this is the account of around the 3rd century BC. It's part of the reading of Homer and the significance of the Homeric myths in Greek culture, which you've encountered in first year English here, even when we looked at Plato's critique of Homer and the role of Homeric paideia in the education of the Greek polis, right? So the Republic is written as a critique of the place of the epic poets in educating the people, and the suggestion of Socrates in Plato's account is to suggest that the philosophers ought to replace the poets and the poets ought to be banished because they don't tell the truth, right? Another suggestion was for the origin of these Homeric myths and legends was a fellow by the name of Euhemerus, and he posited that the many gods were actually historical personalities that eventually became deified and made into, so these were historical figures that took place in play. So Zeus, Hera, Aphrodite, all of these characters were actually human figures that eventually took on a mythical, legendary character and became divinized, as it were. That's an explanation for it and why they appear to have the sway that they do. It's just a supposition. So it's a work of the historical imagination, in other words, that is given sway over it. Now, I don't think that this ever became a doctrinally acceptable position of the Greeks. The Greeks seem to hold more to their stories than Euhemerus suggested. But note that Lewis departs from this mythological portrait in presenting it fictitiously, not fictitiously, but rather factually. So an important part of his account is the factual representation. And he does it to make it as historic as possible. So he describes the geography of the region around Glome, and he goes even so far as to have Orual speak in reference to far off places, but she even talks about their distance. So Glome is built about as far back from the river as a woman can walk in a third of an hour. That's a very specific location. A time. Now it's not going to be in meters or in feet, but it is an experientially valid. Historically, it's the sort of thing that one would read in a historical account. So it's historically concrete, and what that does is it tries to evolve the argument Lewis is at pains to make that myths are the embodiment or the basis for historical figures and their actions that become in epic form. So it is a sort of a form of euhemerism, what he's doing in that sense. But there's a lot more to this, as we saw last time at Lewis's account. And I left off last time primarily with part 1 of the account. And I said 4/5 of the whole account until we have faces is the story of Orual making her complaints to the gods. 4/5 of it. And they hear her complaint. But what is interesting in part 2, Orual hears her own complaint for the first time and recognizes that rather than a factual historical representation, her words were concealing her true intentions from herself. So there's an aspect of language that is not just revelatory, but conceals. And that's because human language is predicated on a nature that is corrupted And Orual's is presented as corrupted in that sense, and not just Orual's, but the human condition in general. So Lewis is engaging in something that he will spend a great deal more time after this in 1960 when he writes The Four Loves, the way in which our loves are actually all legitimate forms of loves, but they tend to become distorted and become idols. And of course, the chief of those idols is the one represented in Till We Have Faces, the goddess of Eros. Aphrodite, Venus, Ishtar, however you want to present it. Or Baal and Ashtoreth. Same worship of sex and love, but distorted, idolized, and perverted, and resulting in human frustration and ultimately annihilation. So there's all sorts of death cults that are connected with this fertility cult as well. And you will find that there's, in fact, child sacrifices becomes a part of that same cult, ultimately. So I left off last time with Orual putting pressure on her sister of the sort we would regard as, to put it mildly, unbecoming. She threatens to kill herself if Psyche will not come away with her. And Psyche, because she loves her sister, agrees to do this and will hold a lamp up while her husband in quotation marks, sleeps. And she agrees to do this. And when she does this, there's a consequence for Psyche. And the consequence is that she's banished from the castle and forced to wander as an exile. I think that's where we left off. And at that point, the god of the mountain appears to Orual and states that Psyche now has to endure hardship at the hand of a force that he himself could not fight because she's committed a sin. That there's nothing he can do. She's denied, she has disobeyed his sole command, which is you can't look at me. And the really interesting thing then, and the thing that's totally, to my mind, mysterious at this point, is his declaration that you too shall be Psyche. That makes no sense at this stage in the story. But it's so troubling to Orual that she tries to interpret it for the rest of her life. And her interpretation is that as Psyche is going to have to suffer in exile and wandering, she too will suffer. That's her understanding, because she thinks that the gods hate her, and therefore they want her to suffer. Because Orual is suffering and Psyche is suffering, the meaning for each of them is the same, because the gods, after all, are cruel. That's what she knows about the gods. She's seen Unget and seen the blood sacrifice, and interprets that as a sign that the gods are malevolent and hostile towards all of humanity. And so she decries the injustice of the gods and complains and said if they'd shown her a picture of Psyche's happiness, that was easier to believe, she wouldn't have ruined it and wouldn't have forced her sister to break the command. So it's their fault for not revealing enough. It's not her fault. And so then from that moment on the mountain, she then takes on a different demeanor, and she conceals her face from that point onward and becomes a great queen. She becomes a queen, a warrior, a diplomat, a reformer, a politician, even an architect, a judge, and she basically works herself, spends her days working so that she doesn't have to think about this. She's trying to assuage her guilt. There's a deep-seated trouble in Orual's breast, which she covers up through her brilliant work as queen, but she has no love in her life. Remember, Psyche is gone. The rest of her family, it's plain, she doesn't care about, and they certainly don't care about her. And the one man that she does seem to love, Bardia, is married and faithful to his wife. And the gods, in response to her pain, are silent. And they seem merciless and uncaring. Now, that is the same portrait that we get in the last battle. Remember, we talked about the last battle and how Aslan seems to be hidden. He doesn't appear in the story. And all of the protagonists seem to act without any restraint on their actions, and things seem to be getting worse and worse and worse. We have the same pessimistic portrait of life throughout more than 2/3 of the last battle. And I had said that there are two ways in which in the Christian tradition God has been seen. One is that he's unknowable, Deus incognito. He's unknowable. That's that of the mystical tradition, and very, very influential in the medieval period. I think it's to be found in Dante's work. There's a mysticism. It's very prominent in the medieval period. The idea that God is ultimately unknowable, and we therefore approximate him through the use of virtues, and then revelation is necessary after that. But ultimately, God is unknowable, and when he does reveal himself, it's through certain virtues, but not through personal intervention. That's the one tradition, the more important one, actually, and the more historically grounded one, is that God is not unknowable, but hidden. Deus absconditus. He hides himself. And I said to you that this is the tradition, I think, of the church historic, except for the Middle Ages, and it's the position that Martin Luther resuscitates, because the hidden God is the revealed God, and the revealed God is the hidden God. And in Till We Have Faces, once again, he has a God that is hidden, but ultimately reveals himself. And so he's coming back at the same vexed and very difficult attempt to understand even his own conversion. Remember, he started, I mentioned that he had wanted to write on Apuleius's tale for a very long time, even before he was a Christian. He wanted to write on this. And he saw legitimacy in the complaint against the gods initially. And then eventually he reframed and thought about his own conversion and the fact that it had been revealed to him by his friends that God was not like this as he had thought, and all of his complaints against the suffering and pain in the world were actually complaints not about what he supposed they were, which is the presenting complaint, but rather his own sense of love lost, the loss of his mother, and his holding on to that and how it had poisoned his heart and made him ultimately worship his own idolatrous thoughts. He wanted to possess his mother forever. And he deals with that again. He deals it repeatedly, but he deals with it in The Magician's Nephew as well, with Diggory and the loss of his mother. And importantly, in that account, Diggory obeys Aslan and doesn't do what he could have done, which is take the apple to heal his mother. He obeys, and that's consequential. And he obeys because somehow he knew his mother wouldn't approve. It was wrong. It's about dealing with grief, and so much of Lewis's corpus is dealing with that problem of grief as well. There's the problem of pain, but then there's also a grief observed, which he writes upon the death of Joy Davidman, who was influential and dedicated Till We Have Faces to her. But the problem of pain and suffering, and that is not actually the way it presents itself to us, a complaint against the gods. It's a complaint that we can't possess those whom we love and control life. And it's a use of love that is not corrected by the agape love that Lewis is going to talk about in the four loves. So a love that comes from above, it comes to us. It's not like the love that we have, where our loves we believe merit, in some sense, the bestowal of our affections, whether they're the family cat, which has familiarity, or our favorite armchair, or our favorite dinner, or our favorite piece of music, to the friends that we take delight in, to our beloved, whether it's a spouse, or in this case, even a sister, because there's something erotic about this. I don't think it's just friendship love between Orual and Psyche. There's something more to it than that, but there's certainly a possessiveness about it. I don't want to say there's lesbianism. I don't think there's anything that suggests anything like that, but there seems to be a possessiveness about this. This is a sister. It is a member of her family, but it seems to have more significance to her than that, and it's because she's so ugly. She thinks no man would ever love her, but her sister loves her and gives her this love which she most ardently desires, and so she wants to hold on to that love and won't let it go, because she wants to be loved like that, the way her sister does. And so she wants to hold that and keep it and not let it go. And so when her sister's taken from her, she wants to get her back, and she's willing to do anything to do it, because she desires the unconditional love that her sister seems to bestow on everyone. So she presents her sister as an ideal, almost an agape type of love. And to some degree, that is how she's presented. And yet what's interesting is that her sister, Psyche, does not see herself as love perfected. She longs for that perfection of love, which she in her character most closely embodies as a person. She longs for that superior love, and she has it with what, from Orual's perspective, is the shadow beast. Until the point when she disobeys, at which point she's exiled. And at which point the story takes this turn that, as I say, is consequential and results in Orual's complaint against the gods. If I had only known this would be the terrible consequence, then I would have done otherwise. So she's complaining from what point of view? The point of view that God is unknowable. If you had just let me know what you were like, I would not have done what I did. It's your fault for not revealing who you were and what you were like. And I couldn't have known that. So it's the vantage point that Lewis had before his conversion. And it's the same vantage point that I said is characteristic not only of the medieval period, but also of the modern world, which also presents God as ultimately unknowable. And I hear our contemporaries talk about God in those terms, but that's the Enlightenment postulate. From the vantage point of humanity and human autonomy, we reach out and try to understand God on the basis of reasoning. Descartes does it. Hume does it. Hume just says it's impossible, but ultimately, from the vantage point of humanity, we can't know God. Immanuel Kant says the exact same thing. It's the vantage point of the unknowable God. It's not the unknown God, but the unknowable God. Deus incognito. That's where Lewis begins. It's also the postulate of Orual for the first 4/5 of the thing, and hence gives rise to a complaint. The reason I did what I did, which I admittedly did, is because you didn't reveal enough about yourself for me to know what the gods were really like. I thought the gods were horrible and hated us. And I did that on the basis of my experience with Ungit, where blood sacrifice was always demanded. And there was a terrible smell. And I associated that with holiness, but the holiness was repugnant to me. I hated that holiness, and it took away my dearly beloved sister. So that's what she thinks her complaint is. However, in response to her repeated complaints and the silence that she receives back in response to her queries and her investigation, she hears something different, and what she hears is her own voice, and her own voice actually accuses her. or she realizes that her complaints were not really about the unknowability about the gods. It was because she wanted to possess her sister for herself, and that was the motivation. So suddenly she realized that she's a hypocrite, and the veil that she had over her face was concealing herself to the world, but also herself to herself. She didn't realize how deep the problem was, and the problem was that her heart was corrupted. That's the turning point. So she hears a cry of frustrated, possessive love, a cry of one who wants to keep her beloved sister for herself. That's what she finally hears. The gods don't answer her, other than to say, you too shall be Psyche. But she takes that as a malediction. That's a curse upon you, that you'll be like Psyche. Because look at Psyche, she's wandering in exile. So as I say, these are very important, and they are important responses to myth. Lewis originally, when he encounters myth, sees myths as lies breathed through silver, the way Tolkien presents it in Philomythus and Misomythus. If you read that little account, you say this, I say this. Lewis is the Misomythus, and Tolkien is the Philomythus. And it's transformative for Lewis. He suddenly sees this not as God who's unknowable, but rather God who's made himself known. And how has he made himself known? By presenting himself in space and time. The unknown God to which a temple had been built in Athens has now revealed himself in the person of Jesus Christ at a particular point in history, at a particular place and time, prophesied of old, but now verifiable. An objective account can be written about his life. We know his lineage. We know his mother and father. We know where he died. There are eyewitness accounts to his death and his resurrection. These are historical facts. These are not mythological accounts. They are totally contradictory to a mythological account. So the attempts of modern scholars to cast the Gospels as myths is mistaking the obvious fact that everyone who reads myths knows, which is that historical factual details are totally antithetical to mythological accounts. They don't fit. They never are connected, ever. No such thing. Either you're writing history or you're writing myth, but you don't write what the Gospels have presented. Now, Lewis does here, but again, that's with a specific purpose, and it's with a specific apologetic purpose, but also it connects with his own conversion, where he recognized the significance of this, the historicity of the myth of Christ, and the necessity of the virgin birth, and the physical death of Christ, and the bodily resurrection of Christ, and the bodily ascension of Christ, without which the Apostle Paul says we're to be pitied above all men. If we only think that this is a myth. But these things did happen, and there were eyewitnesses, up to 500. Talks about it in 1 Corinthians 15. So very important that this understanding of language then also takes hold. Language can not only reveal, it can also conceal, and human language is also concealing. And what it conceals is what later authors will call the heart of darkness. Our thoughts are not clear and transparent to ourselves. We deceive ourselves, and the truth is not in us. What did I say? Like quoted last time, 1 John, I think 1. If we say we are without sin, we deceive ourselves, and the truth is not within us. But if we confess our sin, he is faithful and willing to cleanse us from all unrighteousness. Right? So the confession of sin is the moment when we recognize that our own language and its attempt to formulate our complaints against the unknown God are actually disguised forms of possessive love that makes us want to hold on to our sin and everything that we create as our own framework of objection against God's rule over our lives. I've personalized it here because Lewis is personalizing. I think this is why he frames it this way. Any comments or questions about that? I think is really important. So it again, and these two views of God need to be clear in your mind. Orual up to this point, up to part 2, is seeing God as unknowable. I could not have known. It's not my fault. It's your fault for not revealing yourself to me sufficiently clearly. And then she realizes, actually, that's not her real complaint. That's just what we call the presenting complaint. And as somebody who's worked in evangelism and remembers my own conversion, that is almost always the case. People say, well, here's my objection. And when you contradict that objection, by the way, which is pretty easy to do in most cases, they then come up with a second objection, and then a third, and then ultimately they come up with the real one. And at that point, they get the pat lip out and so forth. There's something there that they didn't want to, because they didn't think it was defensible. It was a little bit too subjective and personal. It's not intellectually respectable to say the real reason is because whatever. And it's usually sexual sin in our day. I don't know if it always has been, but usually it is. I want this, and I'm not allowed to have this, and so that's why. I can't, which means I won't. So, okay, so then in part 2, she begins the second part of the book stating that, and this is the extraordinary thing, her previous accusation that the gods are unjust is wrong. And the only reason that she doesn't rewrite the whole book is because she's about to die and doesn't have time to do it. So she's just going to append this effectively recension of what she wrote before. And it's fantastic as a book because precisely she does do that. It's a plausible way about a man, C.S. Lewis, who was like Orual, who suddenly realizes that the story of his old way of understanding the gods is important in expressing how his contemporaries understand God, and also how they misrepresent their own loves in their reading of the Gospels or the Bible or their understanding of Christian life. They're motivated by a distorted self-awareness. They don't have a clean conscience. They don't have pure thoughts. Their reasoning is not as credible as they'd like it to be, or would present it to be. And all of those things reveal itself because, having seen Orual portray herself throughout the story, we get the sense, and I said this last time, that she is an unreliable narrator. That's what we come up with. We think, I don't trust her. But on the other hand, there is no one else speaking here. The gods aren't speaking. Orual is the only one writing the story. I don't trust her either. But who am I to trust? We have no one else. The authorial voice does not come in here, and this is why Lewis's book is so good. We don't have C.S. Lewis, the author, or the man intruding with the authorial voice, overriding the voice of the character, which he does occasionally in Narnia. Every once in a while, he comes in and makes a comment. And for those who are too harsh with Lewis on this, Homer does this himself. He occasionally comments as the Homeric voice comes from the outside and says, "Oh, Eumaeus, my swineherd, and then you said this." Praise, like who's the you speaking to Eumaeus? It's not the muse that's been speaking thus far. Suddenly there's a voice that comes in. It's Homer's own voice praising Eumaeus because he loves Eumaeus for doing the right thing, even in the most adverse of circumstances. But Lewis doesn't do that here. He doesn't intrude. He lets Orual contradict herself. And I think that makes it a better story. And Lewis thinks that it's by far his best story, and I think he's correct in this. So she doesn't rewrite the book because she's, at least this is the reason she gives, she's too old and she's ill, and if she wanted to rewrite it, she would fail. And she wants to make sure that it's done. So she just adds the remainder of it. And when she adds it, she also relates some really interesting facts. She says that she's experienced dreams and visions, and she doubts their veracity, except that they're now happening not when she's asleep, but during the day when she's awake. The same sort of thing we see in Joseph, we see in Daniel as well. We don't get the sense the dreams are at night. We have, I don't know, some of you dream at night. Some people don't, but we get no sense that Joseph is dreaming at night. We just have that he's dreaming. Likewise, Daniel, there's no sense that he's dreaming, and we have difficulty with interpreting dreams. Remember, if you want to look at different ways in which dreams are understood by the ancient medieval world, go to that section of the Discarded Image where he talks about the 5 ways in which dreams can be understood. And were understood by the ancients. It's not unambiguous. Don't take them as expression, like the Freudian expression of sublimated desires. And therefore, maybe archetypally true as Jung takes them to be, but probably just suppressed libido in some ways. Right? That's the interpretation of dreams. It's very important to Freudian psychology to explain, where do these dreams come from? We do have dreams. Why is there something that's true about them? Well, it's because they express something that we sublimate, we suppress, and then they come out. And that coming out of the sublimated desires is actually important to our identity, and therefore we need to recover those and endorse them and express them as part of our self-identity. And the psychologists will latch onto this and say, what dreams are is our sublimated desires, which if we only affirm, will liberate us and let us be our true selves. And so we can author ourselves, our own identity. Now that holds true unless, as Lewis says, that the human heart is corrupted, or as Lewis portrays. And the heart actually is, as the scriptures portray it, is wicked above all things. And so as Jesus says, if you want to clean a bowl, you have to clean it from the inside. And then further, if you clean the inside, then the whole dish is clean. Well, how about the outside? That doesn't matter. And again, he's talking about the human heart. You have to be clean from the inside. Well, so the inside is the problem of the dirt. The Pharisees are dealing with the outside, external dirt. So up to this point is Orual. She's masking herself as if that's going to solve her problems. But the problem is that she is hidden from herself. She is hiding her own deceitful heart from herself and accusing the gods, and the gods don't answer her. But in their silence, they're eventually bringing her to hear her own voice. And now she realizes that the accusatory voice that she was directing towards the gods ought more legitimately to have been directed towards her. And now she's getting daydreams that are telling her things that she would have doubted. And what the daydreams tell her is they give her a series of impossible tasks to perform. What were they? Sorting a giant mound of different seeds into separate piles with no allowance for error. One seed out of place, you fail. Collecting the golden wool from a flock of murderous rams. Strange dreams, like Daniel type dreams. Fetching a bowl of water from a spring on a mountain which cannot be climbed, and furthermore is covered with poisonous beasts. These are impossible. These are dreams that require her to do certain things that she cannot fulfill. These are tasks that she's revealed that she has to do. And when she's in the midst of the last vision, she's led to a huge chamber in the land of the dead and given the opportunity to read out her complaint in the God's hearing. And when she reads, she discovers, instead of reading the book that she just written, she reads off a paper that appears suddenly in her hand. It's a different account. And it contains her true feelings. In other words, everything that's been written thus far was not true to her up to this point hidden feelings. And we find that her motives were far less noble than she presented themselves to be, as the Pharisee to herself. Right? She's whitewashed her own sins. She's seen a speck in her eye and a log in the God's eyes, whereas it's the other way around. Suddenly she has a revelation about her nature, which then prompts a rethink about what the gods are like. And she thinks she's only been speaking for a short time, but when Stott realized that she's been poring over a story of this inner conflict for days of inner turmoil and repeats herself over and over again, and the gods don't speak. They're silent. And what ends up coming at the outcome of all of this is that she realizes that rather than being jealous of Psyche, she was actually jealous of the gods, because they were allowed to enjoy Psyche's love and she was not. She was jealous of the gods, not jealous of Psyche. And interestingly, as I say, the gods again don't respond. Now, go back to the last battle. There's a lot, but there's more complexity about this account. I'm submitting to you that she's revisiting the account of God in the last battle, this apparent deus incognito, which is actually the deus absconditus. He's hidden himself till the point in which he reveals himself. Same sort of twist in the tale happens here. And in response to the silence of the god, she's actually content because she sees it as an answer. She reinterprets the silence. And what does the silence betoken? It's a mirror held up to her that she's been lying the whole time to herself and to everyone else by writing this complaint. And the reason why she is thankful is she finally understands the truth of her own life and actions. So it's a process. Now, is Lewis talking in veiled terms about his own conversion? I think he is, actually. So this idea on Addison's Walk that Christianity is a true myth started a process of months over Lewis's life, and we don't know the specifics when he says, I became a Christian, but it's months later. And what is going on in his head in between, he doesn't get into the gory details of this, but I suspect something along the lines of what's going on here with Orual is happening. He is revisiting all of his complaints against the gods and realizing that what was presented as a complaint against the gods was actually an awareness that he was bitter and wanted to hold on to his mother and lost her. And he wanted her back. And he was so upset about this and angry and disturbed. But at that point in this story, the fox appears. Now remember, we're in the realm of the dead here, in a ghost, and the fox leads her into an area that is sunlit now. That's not like the underworld of Homer, where it's the shades. Takes her into a sunlit area, and then she learns the story of what Psyche has been doing. Only at this point, after repentance and confession of sin, now she is purified from that. Because remember, she's not angry anymore. She's recognized that she's the problem. At that point, she's led to the story of what Psyche's been doing. What has she done? She's been assigned the same impossible tasks that Orual could not perform in her own dreams. She's been assigned the tasks, and she's able to complete them with supernatural help. And then she leaves that sunlit vista and goes into an area, and it's a green field and with a clear pool of water and a brilliant sky. It's a lot like The Magician's Nephew in that sense. Again, it's a paradisal state. And there she meets Psyche in person. And she's just come back from the last task, which was to retrieve a box of beauty from the underworld. A box of beauty. Remember how ugly Orual is. Remember how beautiful Psyche is. But she's gone to retrieve a hidden box of beauty from the underworld, which he then gives to Orual. And Orual is barely conscious of this, because at that moment she senses, hold on, something else is happening. This is really interesting, because you could think at this point she's being given the thing that she was most bitter about, the fact that she was ugly. She's been given the gift of beauty. So she can become beautiful. But actually, because she has truly converted, she's not interested in the beauty anymore. She's been pulled towards what beauty betokens, what it signifies beyond itself. That's what the significance of what's going on in this passage. The god of the mountain is coming to be with Psyche, she realizes, and judge Orual, but the only thing he says is, you also are Psyche. In other words, he comes to her and he loves her. And then the vision ends. And so what was at first understood to be a curse, you too shall be Psyche, the reader finally understands that word of apparent curse is a word of mercy and love. You too shall be Psyche. And then she wakes up from the vision and then dies, and with enough time to record her visions and so forth, say, I don't hate the gods anymore. And she sees that their very presence, as much as it was concealed from her, is exactly the answer she always longed for and always needed. So at that point, so it's a point of revelation. It's first of all self-revelation, and then revelation about the gods. You see how it's consistent with how Lewis understood his own conversion, but also how he portrays it in the rest of his fiction. And also why, to some degree, he thinks that apologetics on its own is insufficient. They didn't persuade him. Because, again, he's dealing with what he later calls, in Paralander, calls the voluble self, the talkative self, that's always saying things and asking and demanding an answer, but doesn't actually present the real objection. The real objection is not the presenting objection. It's a deeper thing than that. And when you understand that the love of God is actually enacted in history, the agape love of God, when love comes down, then it transforms. And that's what happens in this story, just as it did to Lewis. And then it transforms his life, just like it does Orual's. Comments or questions?